Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise on behalf of the security-conscious Canadians in the vigilant riding of Algonquin-Renfrew-Pembroke to speak on Bill C-22, the Act Respecting Lawful Access. The Conservatives support giving law enforcement the tools they need to combat crime and keeping communities safe. At the same time, these powers must be accompanied by strong safeguards, clear limits, and independent oversight to protect Canadians' rights and freedoms. Conservatives support sending this bill to committee for careful review. This bill represents a major test for the Prime Minister and his ill-gotten majority. Had Canadians collectively decided to actually elect a majority government last year, we would not even be debating this bill. The Liberals would have used their majority to force through Bill C-2. Bill C-2 was the Liberals' first attempt at a lawful access bill. It was only because of a minority government that the Conservatives were able to prevent the Liberals from passing it. If the Liberals had gotten their way, they would have had the power to limit Canadians' use of cash. Bill C-2 would have allowed the Liberals to open your mail without a warrant. The bill would have allowed Liberals to demand any data from any service provider without a warrant. That would have applied to telecoms companies, as well as hospitals and banks. Even Canadians' dry cleaners were subject to this law. C-2 was an obvious overreach. The absence of those provisions in this new bill only proves that Conservatives were right. Just as with the first bill, this new version is not perfect. There are troubling issues related to metadata retention and the legal thresholds to access Canadians' private information. It may be possible to address or correct those issues in committee. Whether or not the Liberal MPs on the committee will be willing to adopt those corrections is the test. Will this be a typical Liberal majority under a typical Liberal Prime Minister? How this bill is handled will provide the Canadians with the answers. By the time Jacques Chrétien was in his third majority, journalists were writing books with the titles like The Friendly Dictatorship. After Justin Trudeau was given a blank check by Jagmeet Singh's NDP to govern like he had a majority, he illegally invoked the Emergencies Act and violated Canadians' charter rights. The only thing worse than a Liberal Prime Minister with a majority government is the Liberal Prime Minister who's convinced himself he is serving in a time of a unique crisis requiring new powers. Jean Chrétien nearly led us to the breakup of the country. He used that to justify emergency spending on Canadian flags in Quebec. He told himself that he didn't need oversight. He was saving the country. When the pandemic finally arrived in North America, Trudeau's first instinct was to seek 2 years of unlimited spending power without parliamentary approval. He told himself he didn't need oversight. He was saving the country. Now we have a new Prime Minister claiming we have a new crisis. He's told himself that only he can solve it by answering fewer questions than any Prime Minister in history. Rather than hiding on YouTube, the Prime Minister should be giving us forward guidance advice to Canadians from the floor of the House of Commons. That the Prime Minister's instincts are to hide from this House makes me think he will fail the test this bill represents. But the test falls onto the shoulders of every so-called Liberal member of Parliament. Too often, they seem to think they're Liberal members of government. During the last election, we collectively knocked on hundreds of thousands of doors. Not a single voter told me their first priority was ensuring telecoms retain a year of metadata on all its customers. I bet that's true for every Liberal member, too. Yet even before new MPs had a chance to find the bathrooms, this government was tabling extensive legislation to give the state vast new powers. The bill was tabled for the same reason we have a fentanyl czar. They thought it would appease the Trump administration. The former bureaucrat turned Prime Minister asked the federal bureaucracy to draft legislation to make America happy again. Before his ministers could staff up their offices with the type of people who might ask what stakeholders, such as Canadian Civil Liberties Association, would say about the law, it was tabled. It was only the opposition holding a majority that prevented this first rushed and flawed legislation from becoming law. Thanks to unprecedented acts of self-interest, Liberals have a hair's breadth of a majority. Will these newly empowered Liberal members use this opportunity to work collaboratively, or will they force this bill through quickly to rack up a political victory? These so-called Liberal MPs think provisions in this bill requiring service providers to retain all metadata for a year are justifiable. Metadata information is contained within many computer files about the file itself. When Canadians send emails, they contain extensive metadata. This includes who sent the email, the time it was sent, the software that it was used to send it, the type of hardware used to send it, the sender's IP address, and every IP address of every server in the email was routed through. Your cell phone calls create metadata that includes who called, who answered, and the time and duration of the call, the cell towers used during the call, and even the GPS coordinates for the caller. Telecom companies retain this data for billing purposes, but they don't keep it beyond that point. Canadians collectively make up 100 million cell phone calls every year. Forcing companies to maintain databases containing information on over 36 billion phone calls presents a systemic privacy risk. Beyond maintaining this vast secret database for the government, the companies will also be required to maintain systems that allow government to easily search and collect this metadata. This is often referred to as a backdoor. The concern has always been that creating a backdoor for the government also creates a backdoor for criminals and hostile foreign states. Now the Liberals will tell Canadians not to worry. They would point to language in the bill that says the government is not allowed to ask for any backdoors, which the company believes would create a hacking risk. Unfortunately for these Liberals, they tabled this bill just weeks before the world learned that the AI company Anthropic had built an AI model so advanced and so dangerous, the company has limited access to it. The danger was this new AI model had discovered thousands of new vulnerabilities in some of the most popular code. One of the most widely used operating systems for routers had a vulnerability which had been undiscovered for 27 years. This government is asking Canadians to trust Bell, Rogers, and TELUS to know in advance if the government is putting our privacy at risk. Mr. Speaker, I should clarify something. I don't know if Bell, Rogers, and TELUS are covered by this bill. It's a reasonable assumption. Or in the language of this bill, I have a reasonable suspicion that the big three telecoms are going to be included. The actual list of providers can be found under Schedule 1 of the bill. That page is currently blank. It's left to Cabinet to decide which companies are covered. Cabinet will decide what measures companies will have to take to provide access to the company's information. In making these regulations, Cabinet will be required to consider the cost of regulations, the feasibility of the regulations, and the impact of the regulations. But just in case those factors end up limiting the government, Cabinet has the power to also consider any other factor Cabinet thinks is relevant. How convenient for the Liberal Cabinet. This is just one example of one loophole in a substantive bill. This is why Conservatives support moving it to committee. The intent of the bill is to allow police and CSIS to do their jobs. The committee must be given the time it needs to hear from the witnesses. It needs the time to provide the level of scrutiny that such a bill demands. We know this Prime Minister is impatient. He's used to people just following orders. We've already seen how he's mischaracterizes legitimate opposition as wasting time. Even the Liberal-friendly Toronto Star is allowing expressions of concerns that this Prime Minister has an authoritarian streak. That's why this bill is such an important test for this ill-gotten Liberal majority. It could be an example of parties listening to each other and to Canadians to improve this bill, or desperate Liberals grasping for accomplishments will jam this down Canadians' throats. The Prime Minister has already failed the test he set for himself. There's no comprehensive deal with the U.S. Food prices are the highest in the G7. We don't need forward guidance to tell us the deficit is already higher than he projected 6 months ago. We need a Prime Minister who will pass the test of democracy.
Hear, hear. In comments, question et commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll stay away from conservative conspiracy theories for the moment, but rather focus on the principle of the legislation which brings lawful access to Canada. And Canada would not be alone. In fact, we're the only Five Eyes nation that does not have lawful access. The concerns of privacy are, in fact, being dealt within the legislation. I'm glad the Conservatives are going to allow the legislation to go to committee today. It's taken quite a while. Lawful access has been up for debate now since last June, when shortly after the Prime Minister was elected by Canadians in this government. My question to the member is, does she join with law enforcement agencies in Canada and many other stakeholders that want to see lawful access in place as law here in Canada? Does she support the principle of lawful access?
Member Algonquin, Renfrew, Pembroke.
Mr. Speaker, you know, whenever a Liberal doesn't have a reasonable response to a fair and explanatory speech, they always call it a conspiracy theory. And you know what we've learned with recent so-called recent conspiracy theories? They've all come true.
The Honourable Member for Beauharnois, Salaberry, Soulange, Huntingdon. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened closely to the speech of my colleague. I'm not sure whether she's wearing her earpiece so that she can understand my question, but here is my question. In C-22, the government has chosen the lowest possible threshold for obtaining information. They talk about reasonable grounds to suspect a crime is being committed instead of reasonable grounds to believe a crime is being committed. And I think the fact that the government has chosen the lowest threshold is raising questions. I'm sure a lot of experts in Quebec and Canada are raising their eyebrows. I wonder what my colleague thinks about the government's choice of the lowest possible threshold.
Pembroke.
Mr. Speaker, I would have to agree with my colleague from the Bloc. In fact, that's why we want to get this bill to committee, so we can examine and root out the answers to the questions just as she asked right now.
Questions and comments. Member for Calgary, McKnight.
I want to say thank you to my honourable colleague for her wonderful speech. Can the honourable member specify what threshold of suspicion is required before the authorities can access Canadians' personal data under Bill C-22, and how that threshold is consistent with our charter rights? Thank you.
Member for Algonquin, Renfrew, Pembroke.
Actually, Mr. Speaker, no, I cannot determine what the lowest threshold is. It's not specifically mentioned, but having dealt with this Liberal government for 25 years, I would say that the absolute least amount of suspicion is required.
Questions and comments. A brief question, the Honourable Secretary of State for Rural Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. When my colleague from Winnipeg North asked a question, you didn't give him an answer. The question is, do you support, to the chair, the question was, do you support the notion of lawful access? And the response was, not a conspiracy theory. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's not an answer. Simple question, do you support lawful access, yes or no?
Just remind the member he needs to address the questions through the chair. I'm not the one answering. The Honourable Member for Algonquin, Renfrew, Pembroke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now the member opposite, who just asked a question, understands what the opposition feels every time we're in question period. They never answer the question.
Resuming to order.